Good afternoon and welcome to today's Ask an Expert online chat series webinar. Today our topic is educators' roles in quality classroom interactions. We'll be together for the next hour, and our featured presenter today is Dr. Gitomer from Rutgers University. Drew is currently the Rose and Nicholas DiMarzo Chair in Education at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. His current work focuses on constructs that are related to teaching quality, including the quality of classroom interactions, teacher knowledge, teacher beliefs, and student achievement. He's currently co-editing the American Educational Research Association's Handbook of Research on Teaching. Drew has also previously served as a researcher and senior vice president of research at ETS, where he led the Understanding Teaching Quality Center. He's done research on and development of assessments for the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and research on assessments for students from the perspective of developing assessment methods that are directly related to instruction and learning. Drew comes to us with a lot of background and experience in our topic for today. And before we get started and I hand it over to him, I'd like to find out a little bit about who's joining us. So you're going to see a poll come onto your screen. We'd like to know what role you're currently serving in and whether you attended our original webinar on the topic of classroom interactions in 2013. Nice to see quite a few teachers on the line, and glad you're spending some of your vacation with us. And it looks like no one attended last time. So the great thing is that we'll be doing a recap of last year's webinar. We won't go into quite as much detail, and you can find in the bottom resources box the presentation for today, but you can also find at the Rel Mid-Atlantic site our original presentation for review and if you would like to follow up after today's webinar. So looks like we have a range of folks joining us, and I think that everyone will get something out of today's session. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Drew.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be back with, I think, the one person I saw who participated in the earlier webinar, and welcome to all of you who weren't able to make it. I'm looking forward to engaging in this chat today and see this as an opportunity in which we can all learn from each other. So how much we learn will be a function of the interactions we have. So I hope you will feel free to ask questions, and hopefully we can respond to what you're looking for. And this whole notion of interactions is actually at the heart of what we consider when we observe teaching quality. Let's see now. All right. Okay. I'm just trying to get my technology here, so I apologize for the delay. So across the ages, philosophers who've discussed teaching have focused on the nature of interactions among teachers and students. Socrates, Rousseau, Dewey, they all saw teaching the teacher as one who facilitated learning by creating opportunities and experiences for students to engage in thinking and learning. And these general principles carry through current conceptions of effective teaching and protocols for classroom observations. So we focus not simply on the acts of the teacher, but to the extent that there are productive interactions occurring throughout the classroom. Of course, this kind of teaching stands in counterpoint to most of the teaching that we all experienced as students and that students still experience in most classrooms today. With lots of exceptions, of course, teaching remains predominantly didactic. There are few genuine questions to provoke thinking, and the educational experiences that students encounter are not particularly engaging. The new generation of observation protocols attempt to capture the quality of classroom interactions, and this research has found a consistent relationship between the quality of classroom interactions and a range of desirable student outcomes, including growth and student achievement. Teachers obviously are in control of many of these interactions, although other factors, such as the curriculum, are also important to the quality of interactions. Any observation protocol can only capture a slice of the classroom interactions because classrooms are such complex social settings. Now, current measures, such as classroom observation protocols, have allowed us to study large numbers of classrooms in order to support claims that have long been associated with student success. Effective classrooms are those in which the intellectual, social, and emotional needs of students are met. Students learn best when instructional goals are ambitious, when they are stimulated to think, and when they receive productive feedback. And of course, carrying out effective instruction requires a well-organized and supportive classroom environment. Oops, I think I went too far. Excuse me. Yeah. Now, judging the complex interactions of teaching is not simple, and professional educators can look at the same teaching and make very different judgments about the quality and characteristics of teaching that they see. Learning to use an observation protocol as it was designed takes substantial practice and feedback. We don't, however, see much difference between scoring observations by video or live in the classroom. In general, we find that it's much easier to judge features of teaching related to classroom management than it is to make judgments about the more instructional and cognitive aspects of practice. Now, one important finding in the research that's been done is that there's a great deal of commonality of practice across classrooms. If we're going to improve teaching, we need to recognize and respond to the fact that certain aspects of teaching are relatively weak and weaker than other aspects of teaching across most teachers. Improving teaching for all students will require more than simply identifying a small set of teachers. Teaching in general needs to be improved, and we need to understand the ways in which it can be improved, including changes in curriculum and policy. So what we see is that teaching in general needs to be improved, which is at odds with much of the rhetoric and policy around teaching evaluation. If our models of evaluation focus on differences among teachers, we miss the important consistencies that need to be addressed. We also see that teachers and administrators all bring idiosyncratic understandings of good quality instruction. And we also see that these new evaluation systems are going, as they're going online, scores are very high and very similar to those that raised concerns and led to teacher evaluation reform. It's difficult to motivate systemic change if almost all teaching is considered effective or highly effective. Okay, so I think Elizabeth?
Yes, so that was a short but important overview of the topic of classroom interactions and the importance of thinking about this. And so now we want to open it up for a question for those out there in the audience. We're interested in finding out what successes you may have had with supporting, monitoring, and providing quality classroom interactions in your setting. So because we have several teachers on the line, we would like to hear about how you may provide quality classroom interactions in your classrooms. And if you're not in a classroom setting, what have you observed or what have you done to support teachers who are providing quality classroom interactions? So it looks like Will has some experience with using coaching as a support for teachers in understanding the interactions that are happening in their classrooms. I think that's great and a good follow-up to one of our recent webinars for our teacher effectiveness series on coaching as a really important tool for teachers to get answers about what they would like to improve on in their classrooms. Drew, do you have any experience with coaching as an important piece for teachers understanding the classroom interactions?
Well, yes, and certainly there's a lot of research that suggests that good coaching can be very helpful. You know, teaching, as we know, is a fairly isolated task where professionals don't get an awful lot of feedback and opportunity to talk about their practice, except in pretty abstracted kinds of ways. So having, you know, one of the powers, I think, of these evaluation systems and observation systems is the opportunity to really discuss and support practice through supportive feedback from skilled facilitators.
So I see also Lorna and Marlon both are talking about the instructional piece and the planning that teachers do to ensure that there are engaging lessons and ones in which students can have active participation. Drew, you've already mentioned that a few times, that curriculum is really important in ensuring that there's opportunities for students to have quality and varied interactions. Can you talk to us a little bit more about, you know, what's the importance of planning and curriculum?
Well, sure. I mean, curriculum can either facilitate or inhibit some things. I see there are some comments about sort of assignments and plans. We've done a lot of work around sort of the quality of classroom assignments. And oftentimes when you do that, you see the same assignments in classroom after classroom, which speaks to sort of curricular decisions that are being made, say, at a district level. But there, too, we see that many assignments that students are given don't really put a lot of cognitive demand on the students. And here's where I think there's just great potential for the kinds of things that are being developed in the context of the student learning objectives, student growth objectives. They go by different names in different states. But the notion is that we can have sort of common libraries, potentially, and that varies also state to state, of what makes a good task, what calls on, asks students to engage in meaningful sorts of intellectual exercise. And one of the things we see when we look at the quality of student work, it's directly related, and not surprisingly, to the kinds of questions they're asked. If you don't ask much of students, they don't give you much. But if you ask more, we see much richer kinds of responses and greater evidence of student thinking. So I think there are ways to improve this. I think that, frankly, some of our evaluation systems make this more difficult, because if you ask kids challenging kinds of things, and yet the evaluation system somehow treats teachers poorly if kids aren't all successful on that particular assignment, then you kind of have mixed messages. So I think that there are some tunings in the system that have to happen so that we can encourage challenging tasks and don't ding people because we ask teachers, the students, to engage in those tasks.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you for that elaboration. And we've gotten a few more responses here. It's interesting, Stephanie talks about wait time, and as a teacher, and even in this webinar, it's difficult sometimes to allow for that wait time. It seems uncomfortable for us as teachers, but another good marker of ensuring students have the opportunity to prepare for their response. Drew, is there anything there you want to comment on?
Sure. Sure. So, I mean, that's a great point, because for many years there was this process product research in teaching, which basically looked at what teachers did. It didn't look at the real interactions. And so you might have an evaluation system that looked at, for example, teacher wait time. And if teachers waited for a while, that was a good thing. If they asked certain questions, that would be a good thing. And I think that what the current generation of observation protocols do, and I think is a good thing, is they're looking at the quality of interaction. So if a teacher waits, but it doesn't spur conversation, then that's not enough. Or if you ask a good question, seemingly, and kids don't take those questions up, then there's something missing there as well. So that's why it's so important and so actually challenging. One of the challenges in training people to use these protocols well is getting them to look at the kids and look through the kids' eyes a lot. So yes, I think wait time, there's an ample literature that can be very helpful. But at the end of the day, you want to actually look at how wait time allows kids to speak more, and you're seeing more of that talking. And even if kids don't respond immediately, it opens up the possibility for richer conversations. So it's a technique, but it needs to be referenced against what its impact is in terms of the classroom interaction.
That's an excellent point, and one that brings me to Rebecca's comment about students giving them the opportunity to be more inquisitive and explore ideas, knowing that the teacher does not need to direct every aspect of the instructional process. And I think that we can see, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Drew, that with the Common Core standards, especially in math and language arts, what we're seeing is that this is really embedded within the standards, that there is this notion that we want to see more classroom interactions among peers and among the teacher and the students. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, if we look at the Common Core, if we look at the new science standards, all of those really privilege sort of kids engaging in disciplinary practices. And so part of those practices are engaging in kinds of thinking and inquiry and exploration that people within disciplines do. And so the traditional didactic model of just, accruing concepts and skills is not allowing kids to develop those practices. And so it becomes, these become valued outcomes that we're trying to cultivate and pay attention to. So yeah, I think it's absolutely, Rebecca's right on point there.
Well, that's great. Let's move on to our next slide, and we'll have some more opportunities for folks to respond and ask their own questions. As a reminder to all the participants, feel free to use the parking lot for any questions that come up as you're hearing what Drew's sharing, and we'll be glad to respond to those throughout the webinar. So back to you, Drew.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about some of the strategies that we've seen for success from the research literature. And we do see some promising practices in various systems. And there are ones in which there's a sustained effort across a system. And that system could be a school, it could be a district, to ensure that people are developing a common understanding of what good teaching is, what it looks like in practice, its rich feedback. But not surprisingly, this means having multiple people looking at the same teaching and discussing it. It means separating the evaluative function from the feedback function so that stakeholders are more willing to have candid discussions of practice rather than providing rationale for employment actions. And one thing that's missing in most systems, but so important and helpful where it is in place, is conducting research on the quality of the evaluation systems as they emerge. We can't expect to have effective systems and develop them if we don't have any data on how they're operating. And there are precious few systems across states that are being developed, and we've been examining those state systems. It's precious few systems that right now in which regular monitoring and research is occurring, or where data is even available about the quality of what's going on inside the system. Okay, so I think that goes back to you, Elizabeth.
Sure thing. So now we talked a little bit about successes, and we'd like to hear about the challenges you might be having. We know that they're happening out there, and we want to see if Drew can kind of help problem solve some of this with you. We're going to put up another poll, and we'll be interested to hear about some challenges you might be experiencing with monitoring or providing quality classroom interactions. And Drew, while we have folks responding to that, I'll take this opportunity to ask at least one of the questions that we had come in. Someone was interested in finding out a little bit more about the current trends in urban education specifically, and if you've seen anything in the research related to quality classroom interactions in urban settings in particular.
Sure. Well, there isn't an answer in terms of a prototypical urban system. The most sort of developed system in place, it's been the most long-standing, probably had the most resources put into it, is the work that's been done in Washington, D.C. And that's had a tremendous amount, not only of federal funding, but foundation funding. And they've been at it for a number of years, have continued to make revisions in the system. And they are, and I've used it as a research site as well. So they're engaged in what I would say practices that borrow the most from what's happened in the research field. They've revamped lots of stuff, and but what they're doing is seriously looking at what's going on. I think, at the other end, there are many urban sites where it's more, and this isn't very different from rural or suburban sites, where it's largely a matter of compliance, that resources are stretched so thin among the administrators, or there's, when I mentioned some of these successful systems, one of the things that's also characteristic of them is that they have teachers working with teachers and coming into classrooms and doing observations, for example. In some places, and they could be urban districts or done by state, it's not allowable for, there's maybe union rules that preclude teachers from actually making any sort of something that even smacks of an evaluative judgment of another teacher. So I don't think there's any hard and fast rules. The only one thing I do think that is emerging that I think is going to be important as more and more consequences occur is that you find that the results, the outcomes in schools with students who are more disadvantaged economically, larger proportion of African American kids, in general, those teachers don't do as well as teachers who teach in more well-to-do, largely white kinds of class schools. And that raises sort of this fundamental question about the whole evaluation systems that I think the jury is still out on what's being picked up. One response is, well, these kids are getting poorer teachers and the system's picking that up. The other is that there's something about the measures that we're using that actually privilege teachers in classrooms with higher achieving students, with students who come into the classroom with better resources on different dimensions. So I think that's going to be the subject of lots of discussion and ultimately lawsuits as we move forward with consequences that occur because of these systems.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Drew. While you were sharing that response, I got quite a few responses about challenges, and I'd like to take a few of these and sort of dissect them and allow you to respond so you can help folks think through some of these issues they're facing. I think, Stephanie, we'll just start from the top. You know, previous knowledge, prior knowledge, what the students are coming in with. I think that that's something all teachers struggle with. How to support quality instruction when students may not be at the grade level or may not have the background necessary to engage with the content in the content or grade level that's being taught. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Right. I think it's a challenge for teachers to engage in that kind of instruction. I think it does take substantial planning. I think to the extent that we have strong curricula in place that allow for that sort of differentiated practice, that allow for students to work and learn from each other within settings, I think it's possible, but I think it requires extensive both professional development and strong curriculum. I think I mean, to Stephanie's point, I think it's very difficult to walk into a classroom with this broad range of students without that kind of preparation and support, and assume that you're going to be able to reach all students equally. That said, I do think that there are ways, and they've been sort of established. I think we may sort of differentiate kids more than they need to be differentiated, and we see plenty of examples where, in fact, kids who come in with different achievement records can still co-participate in academic experiences. But again, that requires some support for the teachers to understand how to do that well.
I think that's a great point you make related to supporting teachers and providing quality professional development that helps them enhance their skills. And along with that comes Amy's point of time. She's mentioning here time to cultivate the quality classroom interactions, but I would also say that the time for professional development and allowing teachers the opportunity to learn and grow in their practice is really critical.
Absolutely. I mean, we can take our lessons from teachers in other countries where, in fact, there is more time, there's more lesson study, there's the idea of, I was on my local school board, and many of my colleagues and administrators thought that the clue to all, or the way to success was just having more contact time. And I think we need to think about that in different ways. And if we can maximize the time that's spent with teachers and students and give more time to training and preparation and how to execute lessons more effectively, I think that would probably stand us in better stead. So that's an important issue. And I hope I was clear, and I probably wasn't when I made my opening remarks, but when I said that, we see teaching that by and large, when we look across the country and we look at these various studies, that's somewhat modest. part of what this is speaking to is that we need to take institutional actions that are going to create opportunities for people to develop in the ways that they need to develop. The answer is not, so what I was trying to do is reject the notion that this is simply a labor problem, so to speak. That there are lots of decisions and allocation resources that we make in systems that don't serve what happens between teachers and students very well.
Yeah, and that speaks a little bit to some of the comments I'm seeing here from Will and Lorna and Marlon. I see a common theme that our expectations need to change. So as educators, but all throughout the system, students, parents, administrators, we all need to change this expectation of what we think teaching looks like and feels like and sounds like, so that teachers can really branch out into this more rich instructional practice. And what have you seen in terms of that, and maybe speaking on the different roles for maybe administrators or parents when they face this new way of teaching, which isn't really that new, but when they see that their students or their children are in classrooms where these types of classroom interactions are encouraged, what's the response to that? And, how do we overcome maybe some of this resistance?
Right. So, let's just take whether it's, so you set up a more challenging situation for kids struggle, and you've got the helicopter parents coming in. I don't have an easy answer for that. It doesn't serve the kids very well. And I just had the other day, a parent called me. We posted a job at a university, and she was looking for a job for her college kid. Now, I don't know what you do with that. But it's a real problem that parents are trying to be helpful, but they're not, and it doesn't serve the kids well. So, this is just a general issue that I don't think is tied. This is not specific to teacher evaluation at all. This is a general problem that we're facing in the schools, and I don't have any ready answer for that. I think the only thing hopefully that you have is a supportive administrator and the ability to communicate to the parents that this isn't serving the kid well, and you're still going to have parents that aren't happy, but I don't think you shift gears because of that. So you have people that are unhappy. I don't know. That's just the way I try to navigate some of this stuff.
So then, how do teachers and maybe administrators navigate this balance between, like Lorna's expressing here, effectively assessing and grading students? So we have this one expectation that grading looks a certain way, or our large-scale assessments are looking at certain things. How do we balance that with a more student-centered instructional practice?
So is the idea that somehow the grading can compromise that sort of activity? Is that what you're suggesting?
In my view, yes. I don't know. Maybe Lorna can express, her opinion a little more clearly if she has a different idea. But the way I'm interpreting her comment is that, with more classroom interaction and having this richer experience in the classroom, it might be more challenging to grade students and how to do that. And again, some of this goes back to the communication with parents and the communication with students themselves. How are we really evaluating quality classroom interactions and providing, some information or grading back to students? And I have some thoughts about that, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, so I think that it's, in some ways, you can tie this into some of the observation schemes. If you're, an educator and you get a score, so you get a value-added score of some number or an SGP of some number, you don't know what to do with that. I mean, what would you do with that? Because it's a number that doesn't have a whole lot of meaning. And you can have an observation system, too, where you walk out of it and say, I'm a 3 or I'm a 2. And that's not very useful. And by the same token with kids, if we just give them a number and there's no understanding of what that number represents or what to do about it, it creates a sense of powerlessness. It creates a sense of just relative ranking that doesn't really give any insight into what's going on. So I think that grades can be useful in some ways, but only to the extent that there's an understanding of what it represents and what to do about it. And so this idea of having clear expectations, ultimately of having a kid being able to evaluate their own work because they understand the criteria by which something's getting evaluated, I think that's what you want to see in any sort of assessment system. Otherwise, it just becomes this set of numbers, and I think to the extent that these evaluation systems are not helpful, it's when these numbers just become numbers and are disconnected from practice.
I think some of what you've just shared, it runs right into a webinar we had last week on one of our teacher effectiveness webinars with Margaret Heritage on formative assessment. And she would argue that high quality feedback and information sharing back to students is really critical at improving the instruction and improving students' ability and teachers' ability to get to the next level. And so that's less about grades. In fact, she made a strong statement that there are no grades in formative assessment and that it's really about providing feedback that helps improve the learning process. And so I think that, they go hand in hand, that the good quality interactions and having good quality feedback on the part of the teacher and then guiding students to own some of that feedback for themselves. Self-monitoring is really critical in helping to bring students to the next level in their learning.
I think that one of the things we don't do enough of, and that we should do, is this sort of institutional checking. And so I think one of the potential we have to improve the system is by doing some cross-checking. So one of the things that we sometimes see is that kids are told they're doing really good work. And they go to another setting, and it's not a quality that's expected in other settings. And, oftentimes kids in urban schools will see this, or rural schools. These kids will do everything that's asked of them. They're told that it's really good work, and yet they're not being asked the same thing. They're not producing the same kind of work that students in other settings are being asked to do. And so, to the extent that we can, forget about grades as just in the grade book, but what constitutes high quality work in different settings, and how do you sort of reference that against other standards to kind of know where things stand and where you are? I mean, it's like in sports or something. You could be the best kid in your neighborhood, and all of a sudden you go to the state thing, and boy, there's a whole bunch of other kids. You thought you were the best, and all of a sudden you're not. So those are the kinds of things that you want to give schools, teachers, administrators, students exposure to sort of this broader world of expectations.
It sounds like you responded a little maybe inadvertently to Will's question in the parking lot. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see that, but he's asking if we need to grade classroom interactions or should we grade the learning and achievement results. And to maybe paraphrase what you just discussed, really the classroom interaction is a means to the end. So if we're having quality classroom interactions that are focused on the content and focused on the standards in the content area, then we should be aiming towards those learning results that we would want to see, the student outcomes that we expect.
Yeah, so this is at the heart of some of the policy debates in designing all these evaluation systems. So there's a perspective that basically says, I just want to know what achievement is. So Eric Hanushek at one point said this, a Stanford economist, and said, I can't figure out all this complex stuff. So good teachers are those that produce learning, and those who don't produce as much learning are less good teachers. Well, it turns out it's a whole lot more complicated than that, and it turns out that one of the biggest factors are the kids that are in that classroom, and the measures that we have are in some ways relatively insensitive to what goes on in the instruction. So at one level, in the abstract, I think that learning and achievement is critical to be looking at. There are probably, many would argue, and I would, that there are other educational outcomes that are equally important. The problem is that we've operationalized all the learning and achievement in some annual test that is, depending on the test, but from a weak to a poor proxy of what the teacher actually is teaching the kid. And so we do have poor ways of operationalizing that, even if we could agree that that's the way. Gotcha. Thank you. I see another question. So he's talking about the students on their interactions. I think that I would say you want to look at both. I mean, you want kids to be engaged in productive interactions, doing certain things. But at what point does that become what you're really looking for in terms of achievement? So if we are focusing on the practices of doing science, for example, those interactions and doing those well, so being able to engage in a productive discussion, to ask good questions, to think through a process, that's all part of the interaction, but in a sense that's also the learning outcome too. So it kind of melds together a little bit, I think. I don't think that it just goes to some objective test, for example, if you wanted to think about it that way, that the achievement is being able to engage in that practice.
I think that's helpful, Drew. I want to touch on one more thing that I noted here in the guide, in the response to this question. Both Jennifer and Laura speak about the content and the pressure, as Laura called it, to cover the content and trying to figure out how to ensure that there's good quality interactions and engaging instruction while getting through maybe the massive amount of content that needs to be taught. Do you have any suggestions, or from the research you've done, have any findings that would help them with this struggle they are experiencing?
Right. So, so part of the Common Core was designed in reaction to that, right, to try to not just have the mile wide inch deep kind of content. I do think the evidence, though, is pretty clear that simply running through this broad content where kids haven't learned it in some level does not produce good learning. So the fact that the teacher covers the content doesn't mean that kids learn the content. And I think that's pretty clear. So they are, but I also recognize that teachers are under pressure to go through all of that. And that's just bad practice. It just doesn't make sense to do that. So, the fact that we do it and the fact that teachers are expected to do that is a problem, and it's something that we need to work on, but it doesn't make the smart thing to do. And that's, again, where I would say some of these decisions that are being made when we say that kids aren't experiencing good teaching, these are not simply decisions made by teachers. Some of this stuff is foisted on them, so they're running through because they got to cover stuff, and there is an opportunity for kids to really understand the content in ways that are going to help them understand that content, also prepare them to have a deep enough understanding that they can learn subsequent content.
I was going to say the same thing, that it goes back to the systemic decision-making and some of the policies. So are your administrators and your decision-makers, both at the state and district level, making decisions in effort of this goal and encouraging teachers to shift the approach to instruction accordingly? And I think that that's an important question, and hopefully we have some folks here on the line today that can kind of move in that direction for their states or their districts. And so I think now is a great time to move to our next question. We always like to wrap up our webinars with an opportunity for folks to respond on what you think you might take away from today's webinar. So we've had a brief opportunity to talk about some ways you're succeeding and some areas where you may be feeling challenged with respect to instructional practice and quality classroom interactions. And now we'd like to hear, based on what you heard from Drew today and maybe heard from your colleagues in the commentary, what action steps do you plan to take as you go back to your schools and districts with relation to classroom interactions? So as we open that up, I do have a few questions that have come in, and I'll give Drew an opportunity to respond to those while you're all responding to that question. Drew, there's a participant who's interested in finding out what areas of classroom interactions you have seen in the research that show where teachers are currently the strongest, and maybe what areas they need to develop. And maybe that's a little bit broad, and you can't quite pinpoint, but I think folks would be interested in hearing about maybe some key characteristics of strong teachers who have an inclination to have strong classroom interactions, and maybe areas where folks need to continue to develop.
Right. Well, I think the research is very clear on that. So the strongest practice is in terms of classroom management, classroom organization. So, when we go into classrooms, by and large, and these are all generalizations, classes are pretty well behaved. And this is middle school, high school, and elementary school, so that they're well behaved and kids are on task. They're doing stuff. So it's not like you walk into these places and they're chaotic. They actually are quite well structured, and they're engaged in academic activities. And so that's the stuff that they do. When you look at observation distributions, those are always pretty high. What you see in much less frequently are things that get at sort of the more cognitive dimensions of instruction. So we don't see a lot of questioning beyond sort of, just did you get the right answer kind of questioning. We don't see a lot of discussion. We don't see a lot of what different protocols call different things, but analysis and problem solving. So we don't see the formative assessment kinds of strategies that Margaret talked about the last time. We just don't see those kinds of instructional interactions that you'd like to see in, and you do see in sort of the highest performing classrooms. And I guess it's not surprising either. I mean, if you look at the history of what we talk about, how we converse, and this is this idea of understanding. We can go into a classroom, and a teacher their first year, they do have to master this classroom management stuff. And if they don't, it all falls apart. So it's not that it's unimportant. It's critically important. And you go into the lunchroom, the teacher's lunchroom, and you're talking about that sort of thing. And if it's not working, the principal's in there and can see that stuff. And in lots of cases, you have school administrators who can't comment very much and provide teachers with real feedback other than that on those dimensions. You know, do the kids seem well behaved? Are they on task? But getting into, say, the mathematics and how well the mathematics is being taught, maybe beyond sort of the knowledge base of the principal or administrator who's observing that classroom. So that's where these protocols can hopefully give a language and images through exposure to what it means to teach math well, to engage in this kind of reasoning, to engage in deep content. And that's where we see scores that are much lower.
Interesting. And, you know, Stephanie had a follow-up question over in the parking lot asking about whether teachers should really be trained in this before they come in. So I'm assuming she's talking about the classroom management. And I think anyone who's been in the classroom knows that you can have all the training in your teacher preparation program, but walking into a classroom of 25 students changes the game. And being able to exhibit quality classroom management in front of those students looks very different in practice than it does in a classroom in a theoretical setting. And I don't know if you have anything else to add about that from the teacher preparation standpoint, Drew.
Oh, well, A, it's critical, and B, you know, one of the things that happens is that teachers get feedback immediately about how they're doing on that from the kids, right? So if things aren't working well there, you know it. And if you really can't manage a classroom, you're out of there in not too long. I mean, you just decide this is not for me. The problem that we see, though, is that when we move to some of these more cognitive dimensions, is that you can create a classroom environment where you really don't have access to kids' understanding. You know, you teach, you give you talk, you have the kids doing activities, there's no real questioning. And so you can have classrooms, we see lots of them, where you would not have a real good sense of whether the kids understand much or not. So, and what they do understand. And so that's why this classroom management is critical. And yes, schools should do a better job preparation on that. But I would say that they actually probably, teachers get more support for doing that than they do for anything else. I mean, the first year is hell, but after that, you know, many teachers become quite competent in that. And there's lots of people to go to learn how to do some of the within their peer group.
And I think Karen makes a good point to further this discussion a little bit, that the professional development that teachers experience once they're in the schools and maybe at the district level, really focusing on some of this, what you're discussing, promoting the cognitive demand, and that's really important, but then taking the next step in focusing on some of this more job-embedded professional learning, such as coaching and modeling and direct feedback in the moment. I think that this is the direction a lot of districts are going in, and providing that really concentrated support to teachers. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with that. We talked a little bit about coaching earlier in the session, but I think this is really on point with the direction a lot of schools and districts are going to support their teachers toward some of these goals.
Yeah, I think I think that's the critical. It's a critical piece to making this work, and we've got to figure out how we're going to get resources and time and develop skills for those people who have that responsibility to do that sort of thing. And you know, and one of the things that's pretty clear is that there are teachers who can provide great support in doing that, but they got to have some time and, you know, and space to do that sort of work. So we've got to leverage that expertise, and we don't do that nearly as well in most systems. And so, you know, there are ways to do this, and it's a critical piece. I mean, I don't know why we do that in many other professions and other settings, and teaching will be no different.
I think that's a great note to sort of wrap up on, and we'll have just a few more minutes, but really capitalizing on teachers and the expertise they bring. And for those comments that we just saw about action steps, I think folks agree, in general with that notion that we need to work with teachers, support them, but also value what they bring to the experience and learn from one another. So we're going to open it up quickly. We have just about a minute or so. If there's any questions that you didn't have answered yet, we would love to answer those right now. And then if there's any we can't get to, we'll be sure that Drew responds to those and we can post them on our forum. For those who haven't attended one of our webinars, you'll see that one of the final slides that I'll put up in just a minute leads you to our REL Mid-Atlantic forum for our teacher effectiveness series, and that's a place that you can go to continue to interact with other folks across the states and across the country who are interested in this topic. And you'll see several of our resources there. So for our first teacher effectiveness webinars that occurred in 2013, including Drew's original presentation on classroom interactions, you'll find the materials there. And we hope that you'll share with colleagues and continue this discussion offline. So if you do have more questions, you can contact Drew. Here's the Rutgers Graduate School of Education website, but you'll see Drew's email address here if you have specific questions about today's topic. If you have more general questions about our webinar series, I would love to hear your feedback or respond to your questions. And because we value your feedback, we hope that you'll respond to our survey and give us some feedback so that we can continue to improve the series. As I just mentioned, here's the link to our forum. And we hope you'll come back. We're going to take a little break for the summer and let you all take a well-deserved break. For those of you who may be getting a break, I know as educators you don't really rest in the summer, and you're continuing to plan and improve for next year. We'll be back in September with our next Ask an Expert chat, and that is on Common Core State Standards and Teacher Effectiveness. And then we'll have our new Teacher Effectiveness webinar on science education and teacher effectiveness. So we do hope you'll join us for one or both of those events. And finally, like I mentioned, we value your feedback, and we'd like you to take our survey and let us know what you think of today's event. And at this time, I'd like to give Drew a virtual round of applause and thank him for his time with us today and for sharing so much good quality insight into what makes quality classroom interactions. Thanks a lot, Drew.
Thank you all. It's always a little strange here not being able to actually hear people, but it's still fun getting your questions, and I hope it was useful. But thanks for participating.